Ever since we started living together, I had been suffering under my boastful mother-in-law, Sissy, and my domineering father-in-law, Isaac. On top of that, they constantly harassed me about not having children. Even my husband, Neil, who was supposed to be on my side, would mock me, saying, "My brother already had kids right after getting married." Honestly, I feel like I've drawn the short straw, and laughed at me condescendingly. To make matters worse, they all assumed the reason we didn't have kids was because I kept working. This is what happens when a woman thinks she can work alongside men even after getting married. A woman who works is probably cheating, they'd say, even going as far as accusing me of infidelity. But one day, I saw Neil cheating, my sister Mariah told me. I was so shocked I almost collapsed, but she said, "Why are you upset? This is something to celebrate, celebrate." She went on to say, "Let's have a party this Sunday." "What are you talking about, Mariah? Why would we throw a party? You've lost your mind," I protested, but my objections were in vain. On that Sunday morning, my parents, Mariah, and her husband Huey all showed up at my house, carrying takeout feasts in both hands. Of course, my in-laws, who lived with us, were shocked at first, but when Dad's prized wine, fancy boxed sweets, and dishes from famous chefs lined the table, they were soon in a good mood. In the middle of this mysterious party, Neil came home and, when he saw something, his face went pale as he began to apologize. Seeing him like that, I finally understood what Mariah had meant. "My name is Rosie. I work in the General Affairs Department of a major food company. My husband Neil, 1 year older than me, works in the development department of a machine tool manufacturer. And we don't have any children yet. We currently live together in a separate house on my in-laws' property, just the two of us. The house is located in a quiet, well-established residential area. And because it's conveniently close to the station, my colleagues and old school friends often envy me, saying things like, 'You're so lucky not to have to worry about rent.' But the reality is far from sweet. Sissy, who never liked me from the start, would often make snide remarks like, 'I really wonder why Neil married a girl like her. If he had thought more about us, he would have chosen someone more considerate, cuter, and from a wealthier family.' She would say this sort of thing whenever she got the chance, spreading rumors to the neighbors and relatives as if I had somehow tricked him into marrying me. But the truth is, I met him at a party thrown by Huey, Mariah's husband. At that time, I had been in my new department for 3 months. Although it was the job I had hoped for, I was exhausted from the unfamiliar tasks and the effort of building new relationships. I had no room to breathe. Naturally, by the weekend, I was so tired that just catching up on housework was all I could manage. I had neither the energy or the motivation to go out and have fun. Mariah and her husband, noticing my state, kindly invited me over for dinner. "It'll be a good change of pace. You'll narrow your perspective if all you do is go back and forth between your apartment and the office," Mariah would say as she dragged me out on shopping trips to large suburban supermarkets. On the day of the drinking party, I had no intention of going and tried to turn it down. However, not only Mariah, but even her always kind and gentle husband, Huey, said, "The next day is a holiday, and you have the day off. So if you're too tired to go home, you can stay over at our place." I couldn't say no to that. It wasn't as if I went just because of that. But when I reluctantly joined, my only interest was in the food at the restaurant Huey, a self-proclaimed gourmet, highly recommended. There were far more people than I had expected. From what Mariah had told me, it was more like a private event than a small gathering. But while the crowd around me got more and more lively, I was focused on my plan. As soon as I finish eating, I'll slip away and leave. I can thank Mariah later. I barely exchanged a few words with the people around me. And it was during that time that Neil, who would later become my husband, somehow ended up sitting next to me, quietly eating his meal as well. Since it would be odd to sit in silence next to someone, I decided to start a conversation, and Neil admitted that he hadn't been very eager to come either, but had been dragged along. They say birds of a feather flock together, and the two of us, sitting there, detached from the festivities, and eating in silence, struck us as funny. We couldn't help but laugh together. I thought it was a relationship that would end there. So when I left as planned, I only offered a brief farewell and didn't exchange contact information. However, exactly 1 week after the party, on the weekend, I started receiving voicemail messages on my mobile phone from an unknown number. At first, I ignored them, assuming they were some kind of solicitation. But the calls kept coming, not during the weekdays, but repeatedly on weekends and holidays. How annoying. What on earth is this? Enough already. Frustrated, I blocked the number without hesitation. But then I started getting calls from a public phone. Now I was really annoyed and considered blocking those calls as well. But at the time, my grandmother was in a rehab hospital and would sometimes call me from the public phone there, so I had no choice but to hold off. Despite my frustration, the calls kept coming. Completely fed up, I finally decided to answer the phone to find out who was being so persistent. When I picked up, it was Neil from the drinking party. Oh, finally. Rosie, right? Do you remember me? Yeah, sort of. I was relieved to discover who had been calling me, but it didn't make sense. I had introduced myself to Neil at the party, but I hadn't given him my number. I had no idea what he wanted. Not noticing my confusion, Neil cheerfully explained, "I'm so glad I got through. Oh, I had to ask a favor from my brother Arnold to get Huey to give me your number." He said it so brightly. Without paying attention to my confusion, Neil continued talking. He explained that the reason he attended the drinking party in the first place was because his brother Arnold and Mariah's husband, Huey, were friends from middle school, high school, and university. And that's how he got invited. Arnold and Huey have always been close, and they used to come over to our house all the time. They were really fond of me, too. However, unlike his outgoing brother and his friends, Neil, being shy and introverted, immediately regretted stepping into the venue. As soon as I got there, I thought, I'll just finish my meal quickly and go home. So I took a seat at an empty spot, and sitting next to me was you. He said that at first, he was a bit wary of me, but to his relief, I didn't bombard him with questions or talk endlessly about myself, which made him feel at ease. However, like me, he assumed it was just a one-time encounter and didn't bother exchanging contact details. Later, when the topic of the party came up in conversation with Arnold, Neil casually mentioned me. And that's when Arnold took an interest. According to Arnold, Neil had attended an all-boys school just like him, and even at the machine tools company where he worked, most of the staff were men, with a few female employees either already married or in relationships. The fact that his younger brother, who had never had a girlfriend, managed to hold a conversation with a woman was of interest to Arnold. At that point, he became determined to help Neil get in touch with me no matter what. But since Neil only knew my first name, he didn't have much to go on. That's when they asked Huey, the host of the party, about me. Huey revealed that I was his wife's sister. From there, both Arnold and Neil begged Huey, who was reluctant, to give them my phone number. But there was a condition. Huey told me I had to back off quickly and respectfully if Rosie turned me down. So, what do you think? Would it be too much to ask to start as friends? His earlier confidence was gone, and Neil's voice trailed off as he nervously asked the question. I couldn't help but laugh at his timid tone. Starting as friends would be fine, I replied, making sure to be clear as I agreed to begin our relationship. Thus, we started dating, and to my surprise, being with Neil turned out to be enjoyable for me, too. I had dated before, but had always been somewhat detached, never really adjusting my life around my boyfriend. My insistence on maintaining my own pace often led to breakups, with past boyfriends accusing me of being cold or claiming that I didn't really care about them. So deep down, I expected this relationship to follow the same pattern. However, Neil was different from my previous boyfriends. When I told him, "Work is really busy right now, and I'd prefer to spend the weekend relaxing alone," he readily accepted it. And even when I mentioned, "I'm going to a concert with my friends to see my favorite artist," he never complained or caused a fuss. One day, I asked him directly about it. Why would I? If I'm tired, I wouldn't want to be pressured into doing something either. And sometimes I want to go out with friends who share my interests. Isn't it just common sense not to do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself? Maybe it was at that moment, when Neil said that I first began to think of him as someone I could share my life with. However, as Neil and I approached the second year of our relationship, he received a proposal to transfer to an overseas production site. Although it was something he had considered might happen one day, when the opportunity actually arose, he found himself hesitating. One reason for this hesitation was related to his parents. Neil had an older brother, Arnold, who was academically gifted, handsome, and well-liked by everyone, and their parents were very proud of him. Neil, who was 2 years younger, admired Arnold, and had always aimed to be like him. But no matter how hard I tried, I could never reach Arnold's level. At first, my parents encouraged me, but gradually they became indifferent. When I decided to attend a university that was a tier below Arnold's, they said to me, "You're just a lesser version of your brother." Even so, he remained silent, believing that what his parents said was true. However, shortly after I met Neil, Arnold, who was working for a foreign consulting firm, was sent on a long-term business trip to Boston. But then, due to an unexpected vacancy at the branch office, he ended up being stationed there permanently. The ones who were shocked and panicked by this were none other than Neil's parents. They were planning to live together soon, having started the construction of a new home after demolishing the old separate house where Neil's grandfather once lived. Yet no matter how much his parents yelled, there was nothing they could do if Neil himself had no intention of returning. Once they accepted that, they turned their attention to Neil, whom they had previously disregarded as the lesser version of Arnold. I knew they were trying to use me as a substitute, but I was happy to hear them say that I was the only one they could rely on. He admitted, looking a bit conflicted. Not wanting to leave his parents behind, Neil negotiated with his company, but because they didn't have any family members requiring care, he received no favorable responses. Meanwhile, his parents scolded him, saying things like, "You ungrateful child. We finally recognized you. That's right. You really are useless." Neil was driven to the brink of despair and was on the verge of submitting his resignation letter when, just at that moment, Arnold's return was confirmed. Then Neil's parents ordered him to vacate the separate house he had been living in as soon as it was finished, saying, "If we had known it would come to this, we wouldn't have let him use it. It was supposed to be a brand new place." Their harsh words almost made me furious, but at that time, we weren't officially engaged yet, so I felt a real sense of regret for not being able to say anything. Afterward, Neil accepted the transfer to the overseas production site. At the same time, Neil formally proposed to me, and I accepted. We did go to greet his parents and inform them, but Neil's parents, who were in high spirits awaiting their eldest son's return, treated my news as if it didn't matter, saying, "Oh, is that so? We'll cover the expenses, so just handle it over there. If you want, you can even give her up for adoption. Oh right, you have a brother over there too. Too bad, Neil." Their attitude remained unpleasant until the end. When I shared this with Mariah and her husband, they unexpectedly responded, "Actually, that's a good thing." When I asked them to clarify, they said, "Think about it. Those unreasonable people won't be able to cut ties with Neil. If they're the ones to do it, it would be a blessing." I was surprised by what Mariah said. She was absolutely right. Neil would never be able to distance himself from his parents, no matter how awful they were. And if we stayed involved with them, they'd surely continue to manipulate and control us, just as they always had. With Mariah's words, I felt a sense of clarity. The next day, I drove Neil to the airport and told him with a smile, "I'll be waiting for you," as I saw him off. For the next 2 years, I visited Neil whenever he could take long vacations. At first, Neil struggled to adjust to living alone for the first time in an unfamiliar country, but with the physical distance from his overbearing and controlling parents, it seemed like Neil finally began to free himself from their influence. He became much brighter and more confident as he received recognition at work, slowly starting to believe in himself. So when his return to Japan was confirmed, we decided to have a destination wedding at his overseas posting. The ceremony was a heartwarming event, attended by my parents, who had supported my relationship with Neil from the beginning, Mariah and her husband, as well as many of Neil's colleagues who had helped him during his time abroad. However, both of Neil's parents were absent, claiming they had other circumstances. Instead, a couple who called themselves the originators came to represent them. According to them, there was a huge uproar happening back at Neil's parents' house. Apparently, after Neil left, Arnold, who had returned to Japan around the same time, had been acting in ways that completely shattered his parents' expectations. It all started when he refused to live in the new annex they had built. During the construction of the annex, when the old separate house was being torn down, Arnold had told his parents, "The construction noise will be too loud, and if they store building materials in the parking lot, my car might get scratched. It's only temporary, so I'll just rent an apartment near my office," and quietly moved most of his belongings into a storage unit without telling them. From Neil's perspective, Arnold seemed to have everything, being the cherished son loved by their parents. But according to Arnold, he had envied Neil for a long time. To outsiders, it might have looked like our parents doted on me, but the truth is, they only paid attention when it suited them. They never cared about what I really liked or what I was actually interested in. The originators continued with a tone of exasperation. So when Arnold was offered the chance to work abroad, he knew if he told them the truth, they'd get in the way. That's why he made up that story about an urgent vacancy. Wait, so the sudden staffing shortage was just a lie? I couldn't help but interject, and they confirmed it with a wry smile. As a result, from his parents' perspective, despite their beloved son finally returning home, he refused to live with them and rarely even visited, citing his busy work schedule. And now, to make matters worse, Arnold was reportedly involved in marriage talks. The woman he was seeing was 10 years younger than Arnold, a graduate of a prestigious women's university, and currently working as a secretary at a top-tier company. At first, I thought she sounded like someone Neil's mother, Sissy, would love, but it wasn't that simple. The woman is an only child, and apparently her parents want her and Arnold to live with them after they get married. But there's no way his parents would ever agree to that, right? So that's why they couldn't come to the wedding. Exactly. They're probably in the middle of a huge fight right about now. I finally understood the situation. While I did feel a little sorry for Arnold, I couldn't help but feel relieved that, thanks to Neil's parents being caught up in their own drama, our wedding had gone off without a hitch. However, I couldn't help but notice that Neil, who had been listening quietly the whole time, seemed lost in thought, as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. After our wedding, Neil and I returned from our honeymoon and got into a taxi heading from the airport to our new home. However, after a short while, something seemed off. The taxi passed the exit on the highway that was supposed to lead to the high-rise apartment we had rented as our new home. Startled, I was about to say something when Neil, sensing my confusion, said with a smile, "It's fine. This is the right way." The right way? Isn't this strange? It feels like we're heading toward your parents' house. As I said that, a terrible realization struck me. Neil gently held my hand in his and said, "Yeah. As you heard, Arnold crushed Mom and Dad's hopes." When I called them after that, they were both crying, saying how disappointed they were. So I told them that we're here for them. Neil smiled as he said this, but his face seemed like that of a stranger. What followed was truly exhausting. Without my knowledge, my belongings had been moved into the annex of my in-laws' house, and naturally, Sissy took it upon herself to inspect everything. She confiscated anything she liked, including the kimono, jewelry, and handbags my parents and grandparents had gifted us for our wedding. If I dared to complain, I was met with a storm of harsh words. And if that wasn't enough, Sissy would throw tantrums that no one could control. Yet, neither Isaac nor even Neil would intervene. Instead, Neil would say, "Why can't you get along with Mom? You need to be more cooperative with her." Sissy, pleased with his loyalty, would respond, "You are always on my side, Neil. I'm so glad I gave birth to him." Seeing Neil smiling contentedly as if everything was perfect filled me with despair. The same incidents happened over and over, and each time, the thought of divorce crossed my mind. But apart from his parents, Neil hadn't really changed since we first met. Because of that, I couldn't bring myself to go through with the divorce. Then one day out of the blue, Mariah showed up at my workplace. I was surprised, but since it was my lunch break, we decided to have lunch together. Mariah brought along her husband, Huey, and for some reason, the three of us sat down to eat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something serious must have brought them here, and the delicious-looking lunch in front of me was hard to even touch. "Rosie, have you looked at yourself in the mirror recently? If your mom saw you now, she'd be in tears," Mariah said as she started eating her lunch. Following her lead, I started eating as well, but although I should have been hungry, I could only manage a few small bites. My stomach felt nauseous, and I couldn't keep anything down. Huey, who had been watching me closely, gently took the fork from my hand and handed me a towel. Confused, I wondered what was happening until I realized that my cheeks were wet. It was then that I became aware that I had been crying all along. Seeing me in that state, Mariah quickly paid the bill and helped me back to the office, supporting me as we walked. Once we arrived, she called my direct supervisor to the reception area and said, "I'm so sorry. I had some errands nearby, so I took my sister out for lunch, but it seems she wasn't feeling well to begin with, and she fainted from dizziness. I don't want to cause any trouble if it's something contagious, so would it be all right if she left early?" Having never taken sick leave before, my boss must have realized that it was serious if I was asking to leave early. He immediately agreed. He had one of my coworkers fetch my coat and bag from the locker and sent me off with, "Take tomorrow off if you're still not feeling better." Mariah then took me to a nearby parking lot, where Huey was waiting in his car to drive me back to my parents' house. It had been quite some time since I'd been back home. How long had it been? "Hello, I'm home," I said casually to Mom when she greeted me at the door. She told me it had been 2 years since I'd last been home. That meant ever since we got back from the honeymoon and Neil forced me into living with his parents, I hadn't been able to visit home even once. No wonder it felt so long. Dad returned from an outing shortly after, and as we relaxed in the familiar living room, I ended up dozing off without realizing it. When I woke up, it was already dark outside. I had been put to bed in my old room, and when I checked the clock, it was 9 p.m. Startled, I jumped up and tried to leave quickly, but just as I stirred, Mariah entered the room. "Oh, there's no need for you to go back to that house tonight. I've already contacted them," she said. "I told them you might have caught something contagious, so it's better to keep you here for observation." She sat me back down on the bed and then said, "I actually have something important to tell you. A little while ago, I saw Neil with another woman. He's been cheating on you." When Mariah said this, I was certainly shocked, but on the surface, I remained calm. Perhaps, after witnessing Neil's drastic change over the past 2 years, I had already mentally prepared myself for the possibility of him cheating. However, it was her next words that left me speechless. "Why are you feeling down? This is a cause for celebration. I've already told Mom and Dad. We'll be coming over to your house on Sunday to celebrate." "Celebrate? Mariah, what are you talking about? Why on earth would we celebrate?" I barely managed to respond, my mind spinning with confusion. Hearing my raised voice, my parents and Huey came into the room as well. "Don't worry, we'll handle all the preparations. You don't have to worry about a thing," Huey said, smiling. I had so many questions, but that night, I came down with a high fever and was so ill that I didn't even notice when the doctor came to examine me. Then came the day of the party. I was dropped off at my in-laws' house by Mariah and her husband, and decided to go inside ahead of everyone. My in-laws looked displeased that I had left without their permission, but I apologize for any inconvenience caused by my sister. We'll come by later with our parents to properly apologize. Mariah and her husband bowed their heads, which seemed to reduce the number of snide comments I received. However, even after returning to our living space, there was no sign of Neil. There were no piles of laundry, which suggested that he hadn't been home in a few days. I assumed he'd been staying in his parents' part of the house since I was away. But then I heard Sissy's angry voice shouting, "Hey, if you're back, hurry up and do all the housework that's piled up." I peeked into the laundry room on their side, but Neil's clothes weren't there either. I found it odd, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. Sissy kept piling on tasks: laundry, dishes, cleaning the rooms, and the bathroom, one after another, so I barely had time to think. Before I knew it, it was lunchtime. Since I had been away, they'd been relying on delivery meals, and the refrigerator was nearly empty. I hurriedly prepared to go to the nearby supermarket, but just as I was about to leave, my parents and Mariah arrived at the house in their car. I couldn't believe they were actually serious about having a party, despite what Mariah had said. Each of the 4 who stepped out of the car held takeout from famous restaurants, rare wines that my dad collected, and containers and paper bags filled with seasonal fruits. At first, my in-laws looked suspicious, but their expressions quickly changed to delighted smiles when they saw the spread of food laid out before them. "Oh my, how wonderful! Rosie, come and take a seat." For once, They were in a good mood and called me over with surprising cheerfulness. I still didn't fully understand what was happening, but with my parents and Mariah acting so excited, I ended up eating the food they'd brought. Suddenly, a short, irritated honk came from the direction of the garage. "Is it Neil? Why is he honking?" Isaac, who was already a little tipsy, said with a laugh. But I knew exactly why. Neil was probably angry because my parents' car was parked in his usual spot. I hurriedly stood up to go to him, but Mariah grabbed my arm tightly. "What are you doing, Mariah? I need to go, or Neil will." "Neil will what?" "Don't worry, stay here." I didn't understand her intentions, and looked to my parents and Huey for help, but they just kept smiling and laughing. Just then, Neil stormed through the door with an irritated expression on his face. "Oh, Neil, look at all this. Rosie's parents brought all this food to apologize for causing us trouble," Isaac said, clearly pleased with himself. "It feels like a party." "Come and join us," Sissy added cheerfully. Neil glanced between the guests in the living room and the spread on the table, looking surprised at first, but then his usual haughty expression returned. "That's very kind of them, but I'd appreciate it if you refrained from making unannounced visits like this in the future," he said, speaking in his usual condescending tone. "You don't have to worry about that, Neil. I won't let them visit this house ever again," Mariah said, and I couldn't believe my ears. Not let them visit? What does she mean by that? Could this party be a way to cut ties with me entirely? I was overwhelmed with despair, trying to make sense of the situation. "As long as you understand, fine," Neil said, still in a good mood, as were my in-laws. But in the next moment, Huey handed Neil a set of documents he had placed beside him, and Neil's face turned bright red. Upon closer inspection, I realized the paper was a divorce mediation request form. Most of the boxes for reasons were checked, with the most significant one marked being infidelity. "What is the meaning of this? I had hoped you might finally realize you were an inadequate wife. Even your parents thought so. You can't even show us grandchildren, yet you complain about your husband's relationships with other women." My in-laws hurled these words at me, but neither my parents nor Mariah and her husband seemed the least bit fazed. On the contrary, they turned back to Neil with even more amusement and said, "Infidelity is a bit vague, so allow me to clarify. He attended matchmaking parties under the guise of being single, deceived women, and entered into relationships with them. Apparently, he's planning to meet the parents of one such woman soon." As Mariah spoke, she scattered what looked like secret photographs of Neil's indiscretions across the table. Seeing those pictures, Neil's angry expression disappeared, replaced by shock. Mariah showed no signs of letting up. Like a magician and assistant, Huey handed her one document after another, each one detailing Neil's betrayals. As Mariah relentlessly laid out the evidence, even I was shocked by much of what I was hearing for the first time. It turned out that Neil's grand plan was to fulfill Sissy's wish for grandchildren, and to surpass Arnold by remarrying a much younger woman, close in age to Arnold's wife, and having children. However, since the free dating apps weren't helping him meet the kind of young, well-bred women he was aiming for, he registered for paid matchmaking parties. But he was required to submit proof of his single status. Unable to provide such a document, Neil had forged one using an image he found online. He then began dating a woman he met at one of these parties, only to be caught by Mariah. "How do you know all these details just because you saw me with her?" Neil shouted. This time, it was Huey who responded in a cold voice. "I was shocked when Mariah showed me the photo of you walking with that woman. You see, she happens to be the younger sister of one of my and Arnold's classmates. Huey and Arnold had been friends throughout middle school, high school, and university, but this particular classmate was a friend they had made after entering university. He adores his sister, who came from his father's remarriage. He even brought her to our university festivals and always bragged about her at our drinking parties, showing off pictures. So I recognized her immediately. Huey said he contacted his classmate right away, and they arranged to meet with his sister. At first, the sister couldn't believe it, but when Huey showed her my wedding photos, borrowed from Mariah, and other pictures I had sent to Mariah, she had no choice but to accept the truth and burst into tears. Naturally, the classmate was furious upon seeing his sister like that and hired a private investigator. That's when even more shocking details came to light. Since they were dating with the intention of marriage, my classmate's sister suggested both of them take bridal health checks. But the results you gave her were forged, weren't they? Forged test results. That's right. According to Huey, Neil did indeed go to a clinic and get tested. However, when the results revealed that he had a low likelihood of fathering children, Neil was devastated. Unable to confess this to the woman he was seeing, he begged a junior colleague from his company to undergo a test at a different hospital, posing as Neil, and then passed off those results as his own. When the investigation agency informed Huey of this rumor, he arranged a meeting with a junior colleague and explained that, depending on the situation, they were prepared to accuse him of participating in marriage fraud. Terrified, the junior colleague confessed everything. Wait a minute. Marriage fraud? That's an exaggeration, he interjected, but Mariah shot him a withering glare. It's fraud no matter how you look at it. And just so you know, she's not the only one preparing to sue you. The matchmaking party organizers received complaints from her, and they're planning to sue you for violating their terms as well, she said coldly. That made sense. For someone like the woman, who trusted the organization to only admit single members, it would be natural to lose faith in the company. If such a reputation spread, the organizers would see it as a threat to their business. As Neil collapsed to his knees in defeat, Mariah looked at him with utter contempt and added, I don't need to spell this out for you, but we'll be filing for divorce and demanding compensation. You'll be paying both her and me. If you refuse to agree to the divorce or fail to make the payments, we'll take you to court or garnish your wages through your employer, if necessary. With that, she glanced at my in-laws, who had also crumpled to the floor, then turned to me, extending her hand with a smile. See, wasn't it the best party? Shortly after that, my divorce from Neil was finalized surprisingly quickly. Neil likely feared Mariah's sharp parting words, but more than that, the fury of the woman's brother and parents left him no time or energy to deal with me. As for my in-laws, the shock of learning that Neil was the reason they wouldn't have grandchildren, combined with the gossip from neighbors about being the family whose wife ran away, and Arnold's decision to cut them off after learning the truth, led to their mental collapse. They now live quietly in their house, which has become something of a hoarder's den, avoiding the gaze of the neighbors. Neil, having been completely exposed by his colleague, is ostracized at work, unable to speak to anyone outside of his professional duties, but he can't afford to quit due to the alimony payments he owes to both me and the other woman. As for me, I spent about half a year at my parents' house, waiting for my physical and emotional strength to recover. And then I began living on my own again. Don't worry, you'll meet someone great one day, Mariah and the others say, but for now, I just want to fully enjoy my time alone.
I cleaned up your room, Lyra. It was a mess. Emerging from my room with a smug grin on her face was Sherry, my son's wife. Oh, Thank you. I had just cleaned my room a few days ago. But maybe it still looked messy to someone else. I decided to just thank her for now. Sherry, my son's wife, never lifts a finger around the house. She's always snarky and throws tantrums when things don't go her way. So, her cleaning my room? That's suspicious, to say the least. I don't know what you're up to, but it won't work. I muttered quietly, making sure Sherry, who was watching TV at high volume, couldn't hear me. Then I went back to my chores. I've put up with a lot from her, and my patience is wearing thin. I've warned her before, but if she continues to act this way, she'll have to face the consequences. My name is Lyra. And I'm 73 years old. I met my husband Frank at a social event. We were both shy at first, but now we enjoy our evening coffee chats. After we got married, I became pregnant with our son George. Frank was thrilled and helped me with chores, even though he was clumsy. Once George moved out for work, our lively home became quiet, and we felt a bit lonely. Then George brought home Sherry, his then girlfriend. Frank and I thought she was beautiful and well-mannered. Sherry looked dazzling as she sat on the sofa with her long black hair tied up and her back straight. My husband and I talked a lot with Sherry, leaving George alone because he was too nervous to understand what he was saying. We liked her so much that we encouraged George to marry her quickly, which they did. Life got busy again with their honeymoon and moving to a new place, but we enjoyed it. We were disappointed when they decided not to have children, but we understood. We thought peaceful days were ahead, but we were wrong. They kept coming back home for trivial reasons. Whether it was a broken air conditioner in the summer or unpaid electric bills in the winter, they'd stay with us but leave all the work to us. At first, we felt sorry for them, but it became increasingly annoying. Frank, who once welcomed them warmly, now gets stressed just seeing them. As for George, he's as oblivious as ever, acting like he can do whatever he wants. My son and daughter-in-law decided to come visit us out of the blue. George called me last week and said, "Hey, Mom. We're coming over next week. Just a heads up." Then he went radio silent, leaving me in the dark about when exactly they'd arrive. Then, just as suddenly, I got a message from Sherry saying, "We'll be there soon, so get ready." I had to scramble to prepare everything. Frank said, "You handle the bedding and clothes. I'll go buy the groceries we're missing. If you could jot down a shopping list, that'd be great." Then he went to change. I thanked him and quickly wrote down the ingredients for tonight's dinner, placing the note on the living room table. Then I started airing out the guest futon. When I returned to the living room, Frank was looking at the note. "Is this everything? If you remember anything else, just text me and I'll pick it up." He left with a smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. Just as I was about to get the clothes, I heard a loud voice from the entrance.
"Lyra? Are you there?"
Sherry was calling me from the front door without even ringing the doorbell. I rushed to open it.
"Come on, you knew we were coming. Why didn't you leave the door open?"
Sherry complained as she walked in. When she heard that, she instantly wrinkled her eyebrows and complained. "What's the matter?" "It's rude not to be happy when someone comes to visit," he retorted. I held my tongue and welcomed her in. "Where's George?" I asked, noticing his absence.
"Oh, Frank snagged him for grocery shopping."
I was a bit annoyed by her nonchalant attitude, but decided to let it go and continued with my preparations. Sherry didn't lift a finger to help. She just sat there, eating her own snacks and occasionally laughing at the TV. After a while, she suddenly stood up and left the living room. I assumed she went to the bathroom and didn't think much of it. But when she returned, she looked pleased.
Lyra, your room was a mess, so I cleaned it up for you.
I was taken aback. She had gone into my room without asking. I had questions, but decided to thank her anyway. She grinned and plopped back down on the sofa. Just then, Frank and George returned. I had asked Frank to buy quite a lot, knowing that the young couple would be staying for a few days. Frank had apparently enlisted George as his pack mule. And it looked like he had accomplished his mission. Frank handed me the groceries, stepping over a visibly exhausted George who was still holding bags at the entrance. After saying thanks, I took out what I needed and started putting the rest away in the fridge.
Hey, George. Stop lounging and bring everything here.
Frank, who had just scolded George still sitting by the entrance, pours himself some iced coffee and heads to the living room. George, looking a bit annoyed, eventually brings in all the bags in a few trips. Man, I'm beat. Mom, pour me some iced coffee too.
Do it yourself.
Frank scolds George again for his whiny tone, but I prepare the coffee with a wry smile.
Welcome back, thank you. Dinner will be ready soon, so just wait a bit.
All right, George says as he takes the iced coffee and heads to the living room. He sits next to Sherry and gulps down his drink. I continue preparing dinner, but Sherry doesn't offer to help. Not that I expected her to. In fact, I'd rather she didn't, she might mess something up. Eventually, dinner is ready, and we all eat. It's a simple spaghetti meal, but no complaints from George or Sherry, so it's all good. After dinner, the room has that relaxed post-meal atmosphere. Frank and the young couple are watching TV. No conversation, but that's better than the alternative. I leave the living room to get their change of clothes. On my way, I run into Frank, who's just come out of the shower.
Should I offer George the shower first?
I can go last.
Oh, you've been out shopping. I can't make you wait.
I enter the living room, laughing, to find George dozing off.
George, don't sleep here. Go take a shower.
Stop nagging. George replies listlessly. I place his change of clothes on him and hand Sherry hers. Sherry takes the clothes, but quickly pushes them back with a frown. I liked the ones I wore before. They weren't this flimsy. I'm taken aback by Sherry's complaint, but arguing would only escalate things.
Oh, is that so? Wait a moment.
As I go to look for the other clothes, George, uninterested in the whole affair, yawns and heads to the shower. While searching, Frank pops his head in. Do you know where my golf balls are?
Aren't they next to the closet where you usually hang your coat and bag?
I can't find them. Puzzled, I watch Frank leave and then go to Sherry with new clothes.
Ah, this is it. You get what you pay for.
Yes, these are clothes I bought when Sherry and I went shopping, specifically for when they stay over. Sherry had insisted on something expensive, and I had given in.
I'll shower next. I don't want to go after an old person.
Just as I'm about to retort, Frank returns, looking concerned.
Still can't find them?
Yeah. Sherry, do you know where the bag of golf balls next to the coat closet is? Frank, seemingly at a loss after searching everywhere, decided to ask around, not expecting much of an answer. What he got was a shock.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you accusing me of stealing? That's terrible. How could you suspect me?
Sherry's loud denial left me stunned. Frank tried to explain it was a misunderstanding, but an irate Sherry wouldn't hear it. George, freshly showered, returned and we all tried to calm her down, but she stormed off to the shower room, still in a bad mood. The living room fell silent, filled with tension. What just happened? George asked Frank, noting that it's rare for Sherry to be this flustered. But why did she really get so angry? I couldn't help but suspect Sherry based on her usual behavior.
Come on, Dad, apologize. You're practically accusing her.
Before I knew it, George and Frank were arguing. It took me quite a while to break it up. Just then, Sherry returned from her shower, making things even more complicated. Now Frank was the one being grilled by the young couple. But Frank didn't back down. Especially when he scolded Sherry for her behavior today, she stormed off to the guest room. George continued to yell, blocking Frank, who tried to follow her.
You keep blaming Sherry, but you haven't apologized for suspecting her. You never apologize, that's what I hate about you.
Fed up, Frank muttered, "Do as you please," and retreated to his room. The living room fell silent again. I sighed and headed for the shower.
I'm going to bed,
George said curtly, heading for the guest room. I stopped him.
The guest futon smells musty, George. Sleep in my room.
Sherry when Frank and George went shopping, and Sherry overreacting to Frank's words. It just seemed suspicious to me, so I started to think that she was planning something by saying she had cleaned my room. So, I decided to let George use my room, which was supposed to be for Sherry.
Your room? I'm fine with a little mustiness. I'm not a kid anymore. What if you get pneumonia?
See, that's what I mean.
Fine, I get it.
George seemed annoyed but gave in and headed to my room. I glanced at the guest room Sherry was using. She wouldn't know about this exchange, being in a bad mood. If nothing's wrong, that's fine. I plan to prepare the guest room for George tomorrow. George opened the door to my room and went in.
Whoa, what the?
I heard George scream and rushed to my room, flinging open the half-closed door. I turned on the light and was speechless. George was in the room, clutching his leg in pain, surrounded by a scattering of golf balls. The golf balls Frank had been looking for were strewn all over my room. In a pitch-black room, George must have stepped on it. Of course he did. Who would ever think there'd be golf balls scattered all over the room? George lost his balance stepping on one, tried to regain it, but ended up putting his weight in the wrong place and fell. It seemed like he hit the floor hard with his entire body. He's clutching his leg and whimpering, tears streaming down his face. Hearing the commotion, both Frank and Sherry came out of their rooms. Frank peeked into the room from behind me and said,
"What's going on here?"
as he tried to help George up. But Frank also tripped on a golf ball and almost fell just like George. I turned around. There stood Sherry, pale as a ghost, trembling.
Why is this happening? This is Lyra's room.
Her voice was so soft it could have been drowned out by Frank's urgent questioning of George.
Yes, this is my room. Speaking of which, Sherry, you cleaned this room today, didn't you?
At my words, Frank and George turned around, and Sherry took a step back, flustered.
Did you see these golf balls when you cleaned?
I asked gently. Sherry just stood there, shaking.
Sherry? Do you know anything about these golf balls?
Still, Sherry remained silent.
Hey, Sherry! What's going on? Answer me!
George, losing his patience, raised his voice. But he's clearly in pain from the fall.
I didn't know. I didn't know you'd be coming into this room.
Reluctantly, Sherry backed away, shaking her head. Frank muttered,
We have no choice but to call an ambulance and the police.
At those words, Sherry collapsed on the spot, sobbing. I immediately called an ambulance and the police and checked on George. He was sitting, clutching his leg, struggling to breathe, his face red with anger. He answered my questions, but his eyes were filled with anger towards Sherry. Eventually, the ambulance arrived, and I accompanied George to the hospital. After an examination, it was determined that George had fractured the top of his foot and would need to be hospitalized. By the time we got to the hospital, his foot was swollen and bruised, almost too painful to look at. The nurses and doctors advised reporting the incident to the police, clearly displeased with the situation. I said I would and stepped out to call Frank. Frank answered and told me the police had arrived and were currently taking statements. Then the call was handed over to a police officer, who said they would like to hear the full story later, to which I agreed. According to Frank, Sherry was just sitting on the floor, unresponsive to anyone or anything. After hanging up, I returned to George's hospital room, received instructions for his hospital stay, and decided to go home to gather some essentials. When I got back home, there was a crowd gathered around, making it difficult to get in. Finally making it inside the house, Sherry immediately started to lash out.
Why wasn't it you? Why did George go into that room? If you had gone in, none of this would have happened to George.
Breaking free from the police officer's restraint, Sherry lunged at me.
It should have been you. You're already old. If you had fallen, this house and this land would have been mine soon.
Sherry, spewing hateful words with a ferocity that felt like she could bite me, was pulled away by Frank and the police. Still, she continued to hurl insults at me, struggling to break free and lunge at me again. And then, Sherry was finally arrested. Suddenly silent as if a switch had been flipped, she was escorted out of the house by the police. She was put into a police car and taken away, drawing the attention of many onlookers. Left behind, Frank and I stood there, stunned, watching the whole sequence of events unfold. Snapped back to reality by the police officer, I briefly answered their questions and then headed back to the hospital with the essentials George needed. When I got to the hospital room, no nurses or doctors were around. After hearing about the situation at home, George, who had forgotten about his severe injuries, started making a commotion. A nurse rushed in, and we managed to calm him down.
I've been suspicious of her for a while. The way she sometimes looks at Mom bothers me. I've been meaning to say something.
Despite what he said, I'd never sensed any such thing from George, nor did it seem like he'd noticed. Rather, he always seemed to avoid getting involved in troublesome matters. George has always been the type to say whatever sounds good to get through the moment. This time was probably no different. I was utterly exasperated. Hey, Mom. I've been thinking for a while now. George, who had been ranting just moments ago, suddenly lowered his voice. Curious, I asked what it was. I'm thinking of breaking up with Sherry. I was surprised, but considering everything, it wasn't unreasonable. I don't know how Sherry acts when it's just her and George, but her behavior during visits has been terrible. She acts as if she's entitled to special treatment, refuses to help out, and throws tantrums if things don't go her way. We've never liked her, but we never thought about forcing George to divorce her. We've never been fans of her behavior, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean we ever thought about pushing George to divorce her. We never asked George what he thought about Sherry, and it felt wrong to even consider it. After all, George is an adult, and it's not our place to meddle in his marriage. Frank and I have even talked about staying out of it if George doesn't say anything. But now, George is coming to us for advice on divorce. I was at a loss for words. Mom, she's always so harsh with you, and she's been rude to Dad too. I can't take it anymore. That's when I felt something was off. Sure, Sherry has never held back her disdain for me. She doesn't even try to hide it, and I assume she acts the same way when it's just her and George. But she's indifferent to Frank. Frank is a gentle soul, but he's not much of a talker and has a stern face. That's probably why I've rarely seen them talk since they got married. So, it felt odd when she got flustered after Frank asked about the golf ball incident. She usually just gives cold replies, but this time she raised her voice. She must have felt exposed by Frank. Do I have to pay alimony if we divorce? And there are hospital bills too. Can you help, Mom? That's when it clicked. George has been trying to butter me up for this very reason. It's heartbreaking, but George is my flesh and blood. I can read his expressions and gestures. I know what he's thinking. I've always found him adorable and couldn't help but meddle, but ever since he hit puberty, he's found it annoying. Like Sherry, George also resents us, but he's playing the good son for the sake of money.
Hey, George. What happened to the money for the car you said you were going to replace?
The other day, when our son and his wife were visiting, my son pulled me aside when Sherry and Frank weren't around. Said he was thinking about getting a new car and needed some financial help because it was a bit pricey. Obviously, if he mentioned this in front of Frank, he'd be met with opposition, so he discreetly came to me. I couldn't say no to my dear George, so I gave him the full amount. But the car he drove home in was the same one he had before.
So, you haven't bought it yet? If that's the case, you can use that money for the hospital bills. It might not cover alimony, but it'll help. But then what about the car? You can save up again once you're better. We have our own lives, you know. You're old enough to figure things out yourself.
I'm pissed off. I was dumbfounded that George still expected financial help from us at this point. I left the hospital after saying just that. The truth is, I knew George had been squandering the money I gave him. Sherry had told me, though she was obviously benefiting from it too. I've always worried about him and meddled in his affairs, but it seems that has backfired. I took this as a good opportunity to tell Frank everything. After hearing me out, Frank said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about this. He recently lost his job and is in considerable debt." I was shocked, and so was Frank, who had heard this while they were out shopping. At this point, there's nothing more to say to George. Frank and I decided to disown him. Some time has passed since then. Sherry is now in prison after being convicted in court. And it seems she divorced George before the trial began. But I later heard that it was Sherry who initiated the divorce. Apparently, they were both initially enjoying the money they'd gotten from me, but George started reducing Sherry's share until he stopped giving her any at all. That's why she did what she did in my room, thinking it would bring money her way. It's a terrifying thought. As for George, he seemed to cling to the idea of divorce once Sherry suggested it, and ultimately agreed. He's not burdened much by alimony, but he's drowning in the debt he created. Of course, the money for the car had long been gambled away. We covered his hospital bills, but he's working hard to pay off his other debts. It's a pathetic situation, but it's the result of his lifelong dependency. I hope he learns from this. As for Frank and me, the money we'd been giving George actually came from Frank. I didn't have that kind of money, but Frank loved George and wanted it to come from me. Now that's no longer an option. We're planning a hot spring trip we've never taken before. I do regret putting George through all this, but considering everything, it can't be helped. Now, the happiest moments are when Frank and I are looking at travel magazines.